the vanishing diner. Ethan loved the solitude of driving long stretches of road. As a seasoned trucker, he prided himself on knowing every major pit stop along his routes. That's why it struck him as strange when, one cold autumn night in Montana, he stumbled across a diner he had never seen before. The neon sign read Betty's Place, its letters buzzing faintly against the misty darkness. It was late, and Ethan's stomach growled as he pulled into the empty gravel lot. The place seemed like a godsend, a beacon of light in the otherwise pitch-black expanse of highway. Inside, the diner exuded an old-school charm. Red vinyl booths, chrome bar stools, and a jukebox softly playing hits from the 1950s. A friendly waitress named Mary greeted him warmly, handing him a menu with coffee already in hand. "Traveling far tonight?" she asked, her smile polite but curious. "Portland," Ethan replied, grateful for the warmth of the coffee. He ordered cherry pie and settled into the booth closest to the window. As he ate, Ethan couldn't shake the odd feeling that everyone in the diner was watching him. The man at the counter, dressed in a pinstriped suit, glanced over his shoulder more than once. A young woman in a polka-dot dress smiled faintly whenever Ethan caught her gaze. Even the cook behind the counter seemed to pause too long while chopping vegetables. When he finished his pie, the man in the suit approached his booth. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow but piercing. "You're just passing through, right?" the man asked, his voice low. "Don't stay too long. Betty doesn't like strangers lingering." Ethan forced a laugh, trying to lighten the tension. "Don't worry. I'll be on my way soon." The man nodded but didn't move, his eyes fixed on Ethan until the waitress interrupted, placing the bill on the table. "Drive safe," she said, her smile now forced. As Ethan stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop sharply. The once warm glow of the diner lights dimmed, and the air felt heavier. He turned back for one last look, only to find nothing. The diner was gone. In its place was an overgrown field, a rusted sign barely visible in the moonlight. The faded letters spelled Betty's Place, but the building itself was nothing more than a skeletal frame of rotted wood and crumbling bricks. Ethan's heart raced as he fumbled for his truck keys. His hands shook as he started the engine and sped down the highway. He didn't stop until sunrise, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Months later, Ethan came across an old newspaper article while waiting at a truck stop. The headline read, "Diner Inferno Claims 12 Lives. Betty's Place Destroyed in 1956 Blaze." The photo accompanying the story showed the same diner he had visited, or thought he had visited. Ethan now drives a different route, avoiding that stretch of highway altogether. Yet, sometimes, in the dead of night, he swears he can hear the faint hum of a jukebox playing an old tune, calling him back to Betty's Place. The lurker in the woods. Jessica was no stranger to hiking alone. The peaceful embrace of nature, away from the chaos of the city, was her sanctuary. She had traversed countless trails across Oregon, her favorite being Shadow Trail, a lesser-known path nestled deep within a dense forest. It was tranquil, untouched, and, as she would soon learn, hiding something far from serene. It was late afternoon when Jessica parked her car at the trailhead. The air was crisp, the earthy scent of fallen leaves filling her lungs. She adjusted her backpack, secured her water bottle, and set off. The woods were alive with the gentle rustling of leaves, birdsong, and the occasional crackle of a distant branch. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jessica realized she had wandered off the marked trail. The familiar signs were gone, replaced by towering trees that seemed to loom closer together the deeper she ventured. She pulled out her phone, only to find no signal. "No big deal," she muttered, trying to shake the growing unease. She retraced her steps, or so she thought, until she heard it. a faint snapping sound. At first, she dismissed it as an animal. But as she continued, the sound grew louder, closer, and rhythmic, like footsteps mirroring her own. Jessica paused, her breath hitching as silence enveloped her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Jessica quickened her pace, her heart pounding. She glanced over her shoulder and caught movement, a shadow darting between the trees. It was fleeting, but enough to confirm she wasn't alone. She broke into a jog, her boots crunching against the forest floor. The footsteps behind her grew more insistent, heavy, and deliberate. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the woods. Jessica froze, her eyes scanning the dimming light for the source. That's when she saw it. Perched on a fallen tree just ahead was a figure. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. The creature's eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the last remnants of sunlight. It grinned, revealing jagged teeth that looked as though they had been carved from bone. Jessica's survival instincts kicked in, and she ran, adrenaline fueling her despite the burning in her legs. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her breaths ragged as the creature pursued her. She could hear it now, its movements erratic but gaining on her. In her panic, she tripped and tumbled down a steep embankment, landing hard in a shallow creek. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to stay still, biting back a cry. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the ravine. Jessica looked up and saw it, silhouetted against the twilight. It scanned the area, sniffing the air like a predator searching for prey. After what felt like an eternity, it retreated, disappearing into the shadows. Jessica waited until she was certain it was gone before limping her way back to her car. When she finally reached the trailhead, her relief was short-lived. Etched into the dust on her car window were claw marks, deep and deliberate. She never hiked alone again. Weeks later, she heard of another hiker who had gone missing in the same area. Locals spoke in hushed tones about a creature known as the Shadow Stalker, a being that preyed on the lost and unwary. Jessica knew she had been lucky to escape, but the memory of those glowing eyes and jagged teeth haunted her dreams. The empty subway car. Dylan was a night owl. His job as a freelance graphic designer meant late nights in his Brooklyn apartment, followed by occasional rides on the subway to clear his head. The quiet of the late-night train was a stark contrast to the chaos of rush hour, and Dylan cherished those moments of solitude. One Thursday night, after finishing a particularly grueling project, Dylan boarded the G line around 1 a.m. The platform was deserted, the faint hum of distant trains echoing through the tunnels. He stepped into a nearly empty subway car, save for a man in a tattered coat sitting at the far end. Dylan nodded politely as he took his seat but avoided making eye contact. The man's presence was unsettling. His posture rigid, head bowed, and hands clutching a weathered briefcase. As the train lurched forward, Dylan noticed something odd. Despite the train moving, the man remained eerily still, not swaying or adjusting his balance. Dylan brushed it off as fatigue messing with his perception and pulled out his phone to check emails. Minutes later, the train came to an abrupt halt between stations. The lights flickered, and the car was plunged into an uneasy dimness. A voice crackled over the intercom. "We apologize for the delay. Please remain seated." The man at the end of the car shifted slightly, and Dylan finally looked directly at him. The man's face was pale, almost gray, with hollow eyes that stared into nothingness. Dylan's discomfort grew when he realized the man hadn't blinked once. Suddenly, the man stood up, his briefcase clutched tightly in one hand. He began walking slowly toward Dylan. The train car was silent except for the rhythmic thud of the man's boots against the metal floor. Dylan's heart pounded. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, his voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, tilting his head as if studying Dylan. Then, in a low, guttural voice, the man said, "You shouldn't be here." Before Dylan could respond, the lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the man was gone. The briefcase lay abandoned on the floor. Panic set in. Dylan stood, scanning the car for any sign of the man, but it was empty. He moved toward the briefcase, hesitant but curious. He knelt and slowly opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs, each one depicting the same subway car filled with people. But the faces in the photos were blurred, distorted as if they were moving unnaturally fast. As Dylan examined the photos, the intercom crackled again. The voice this time was different, deeper, almost inhuman. "You were warned." The train jolted, and the lights went out entirely. In the darkness, Dylan heard whispers, faint, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all around him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were deafening. When the lights finally came back on, Dylan found himself sitting alone in the middle of the subway platform, the briefcase gone. The train was nowhere in sight, and the clock on the wall read 4 a.m. Dylan didn't take the subway after that night. He found alternate ways to get around, avoiding the G line altogether. But every now and then, he'd hear stories of people disappearing on late-night trains, their belongings left behind. And he couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers he'd heard weren't just in his imagination.